What if the grandest homes of the Gilded Age were built on lies? They stood as symbols of power, but behind every chandelier was a mountain of secret debt, foreign loans, and broken lives. How did these palaces of wealth become monuments of desperation, and what did their builders risk to keep the illusion alive? Stay with me, because the truth buried in these walls might change the way you see every empire ever built. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. They called it progress. They called it the future. But beneath the marble staircases, beneath the glittering chandeliers and velvet drapes, there was something far more human, a tremor, a pulse of fear. The Gilded Age was not just a time of invention and excess. It was an era of desperate ambition shadowed by quiet anxiety. Every stone laid in the great apartment palaces of the late 19th century was set against a background of economic uncertainty and personal risk. These buildings, now celebrated as icons of elegance and refinement, were born not from security, but from the restless hunger of a society trying to prove that it had truly arrived. In the decades following the Civil War, America was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Railroads carved through the heart of the continent. Industrial fortunes swelled overnight. Immigrants poured into cities by the millions, their labor fueling the rise of industries that would define the century. And amid the clamor of factories and the noise of progress, a new class emerged, men and women who believed they could buy permanence in a world that seemed to shift beneath their feet. For them, the mansion on the avenue was no longer enough. They wanted something grander, something that reflected the scale of their ambition. The age of the urban palace had begun. The idea of living in a towering apartment was, at first, almost scandalous. To live above someone else was to admit a kind of vulnerability, a loss of individuality. But the architects and investors of the Gilded Age had a vision. They would transform collective living into a mark of status. The grand apartments would not be cramped tenements for the poor, but skybound estates for the rich. To do this required not only architectural genius, but financial daring of the most extreme kind. The land was expensive, the materials costly, the labor unpredictable. Investors poured fortunes into blueprints that promised prestige, but guaranteed nothing. Every new development was a gamble, and behind the polished smiles of the financiers was a quiet, gnawing fear of collapse. Money, in this era, was both abundant and elusive. Industrialists made millions, yet much of that wealth existed on paper, in speculation, in borrowed capital, in promises made across oceans. American prosperity leaned heavily on foreign trust, with European investors buying into a dream of limitless growth. Loans from London and Paris flowed into New York's booming skyline, financing marble facades and wrought iron balconies. Yet every coin that crossed the Atlantic carried a weight of expectation. If the markets faltered, if confidence waned even for a moment, the illusion could crumble overnight. And everyone involved, from the financier in his mahogany office to the mason on the scaffolding, understood this truth, even if few dared to speak it aloud. There was something feverish in the air of the time, a sense that the world was racing forward faster than anyone could control. Inflation crept through the economy, driving up the cost of labor and materials. Contractors struggled to pay workers, often relying on credit that stretched thinner with each passing month. Developers mortgaged not only their properties but their reputation. They borrowed against futures that had not yet arrived, futures that might never come. Still, they pressed on. To stop was to admit defeat. To doubt was to fall behind. In the language of the Gilded Age, ambition was everything, even if it was built on the trembling foundation of anxiety. Inside the opulent drawing rooms and marble-floored corridors, the wealthy lived in a state of glittering denial. They dined under the glow of electric light, marveling at the wonders of modernity. They entertained guests with talk of European art and industrial triumphs. But behind the walls, builders and investors scrambled to hold their empires together. Payments were delayed, loans renegotiated. Quiet bankruptcies swept through the construction firms that had promised to shape the skyline. For every celebrated architect, there were a dozen unseen men juggling debts, praying the next sale would come before the creditors did. The apartments that came to symbolize confidence and progress were, in truth, monuments to fragility. Ambition in this age was not a clean or noble force. It was restless, consuming, and often cruel. The great men of real estate and finance were not merely visionaries but gamblers. They risked everything: money, family, reputation, on the belief that beauty could be built faster than the market could collapse. It was a race between aspiration and disaster, and few could tell which side they were truly on. Every column, every cornice, every gilded ceiling was an act of defiance against the fear that haunted them all, that the dream might fail, that the future might betray them. Meanwhile, the city around them was a living paradox. On one side of the street, marble towers climbed toward the clouds, while on the other, tenements overflowed with workers who earned less in a year than the wealthy spent on a dinner. The elite, ensconced in their new apartments, could look out their windows and see both the promise and the peril of modern America. They were insulated, but not immune. The newspapers whispered of economic downturns, of labor strikes, of foreign markets trembling. They smiled in public, but in private they calculated, always calculating how much longer the illusion could hold. The architects and financiers who championed these buildings often spoke in the language of progress and permanence, but beneath their eloquence lay a deeper truth. They were driven by fear as much as by vision, fear of being left behind, of being forgotten, of losing everything in a world where fortunes rose and fell with the flicker of a telegraph line. The apartment palaces became symbols not only of luxury but of desperation, a desperate attempt to give physical form to success, to turn fleeting prosperity into something solid and lasting. Every arch and ornament was a prayer for stability, a plea to history to remember them kindly. Yet even as they climbed higher, the foundations trembled. Interest rates shifted, banks faltered. Whispers of financial panic spread through drawing rooms and boardrooms alike. The more the city grew, the more fragile it became. Speculation fed on speculation, and beneath the gold leaf of prosperity, cracks began to appear. But ambition is a stubborn thing. The men of the Gilded Age did not stop building. They built more, faster, grander, as if sheer will could outpace the inevitable reckoning. The apartment towers stood as both triumphs and warnings, their beauty undeniable, their security uncertain. In the quiet of night, when the lights of the new apartments flickered against the dark city sky, one could almost feel the heartbeat of the age, steady, determined, but always a little too fast. Beneath the glamour, beneath the orchestra of progress, there was the steady drum of anxiety that no wealth could silence. The Gilded Age was a performance, a dazzling illusion, sustained by ambition and fear in equal measure. Its architects, its builders, its dreamers were not simply creators of beauty. They were participants in a grand act of defiance against the chaos that threatened to engulf them. They built upward not only because they could, but because they had to, because the only way to escape the uncertainty below was to rise above it one floor at a time. It glittered, but it was never gold. The Gilded Age unfolded like a dream wrapped in sand and shadow, a spectacle of wealth that dazzled the world and concealed the truth beneath its brilliance. On the surface, America seemed unstoppable. Its cities glowed with electric light. Its railroads stretched across the continent. Its industries hummed with power. But behind the facades of luxury, the illusion of prosperity was quietly unraveling. Every shimmering ballroom, every jeweled gown, every polished marble lobby was built on a fragile foundation of borrowed money and unstable faith. What the world admired as progress was often nothing more than a carefully staged illusion, a dance of credit and confidence that could falter at any moment. The great apartment palaces that rose over Manhattan were the clearest reflection of that illusion. They promised a new way of living, comfort, prestige, exclusivity, but their grandeur was propped up by invisible debts and foreign capital. American financiers turned eagerly to Europe for funding, their hands outstretched to London, Paris, and Berlin. The old world watched with fascination as the new world transformed its skyline, but it also demanded repayment. Bonds, mortgages, and foreign loans flowed across the Atlantic, binding American ambition to European wealth. For every stone laid on Fifth Avenue, there was a ledger in a London office recording the risk. These loans, so essential to construction, became chains of dependency that no gilding could disguise. The illusion of prosperity was fed by appearances, and appearance, in this age, was everything. The newspapers celebrated every new architectural marvel as a symbol of unstoppable progress. Investors attended lavish galas in half-finished buildings, toasting to fortunes they had not yet secured. The public saw only success, but those inside the game knew better. Inflation quietly eroded profits. Wages rose unevenly. Imports became costly, and yet the appetite for extravagance only grew. To stop building was to admit weakness. To hesitate was to lose face, and so the illusion had to be maintained no matter the cost. Architects and developers competed to outshine one another, their creations becoming ever more ornate, ever more expensive. French facades, Italian marble, Tiffany glass, all imported, all symbols of sophistication, all paid for with borrowed coin. Each new apartment palace had to surpass the last, and each new financier had to pretend his fortune was greater than it truly was. Behind closed doors, the conversations were not about art or vision, but about credit lines and interest rates. How long could the illusion last? How much longer could they convince the world that the glitter was real? The wealthy themselves were caught in the same performance. Their lifestyles depended on constant motion, the endless parties, the new fashions, the latest imports. To be seen as prosperous was to remain powerful, but that image required relentless spending. Many of the elite were drowning in quiet debt, sustained by loans from the very banks that were themselves teetering on the edge of collapse. The wives wore diamonds that had not yet been paid for. The carriages gleamed though the horses were rented. Even among the privileged, the illusion was delicate, and everyone knew that if one domino fell, the entire spectacle might collapse with it. Meanwhile, the ordinary citizens of the cities watched from below, gazing upward at towers that seemed to defy gravity. To them, the glittering apartments symbolized everything that was out of reach: luxury, stability, power. Yet even as they admired, they also sensed the imbalance. The newspapers spoke of record profits and unprecedented growth, but the streets told a different story: wages that failed to keep up with prices, strikes that erupted in desperation, small businesses shuddered under the weight of inflation. The illusion of prosperity excluded most of the people who sustained it. The workers who built the grand apartments could never dream of entering them, except to serve. Still, the illusion persisted because everyone wanted to believe. America was a young nation eager for validation, hungry to prove that it could rival Europe in sophistication and wealth. The Gilded Age became a stage upon which this yearning was performed. Every building was a declaration, every party a proclamation, every display of luxury a plea for legitimacy. To question the illusion was to risk unraveling it, and so the pretense continued, elegant, exhausting, fragile. The markets fed the illusion too. Stock prices soared on speculation. Fortunes rose overnight, and confidence became the most valuable currency of all. Newspapers published the names of the newly rich like characters in an epic saga, transforming industrialists and investors into national heroes. But in truth, much of the wealth existed only on paper. Railroads were overbuilt, factories overextended, and real estate overvalued. Credit was stretched thin, and profits were often illusions of their own projections, promises, numbers written in ink rather than gold. The system worked only as long as no one looked too closely, as long as everyone agreed to believe the story being told. Foreign investors, drawn by the myth of America's unstoppable rise, poured more money into the country's glittering facade. European banks financed projects they barely understood, seduced by the rhetoric of progress. But with every new influx of capital, America's dependence deepened. The illusion of prosperity became a fragile bridge between two continents, swaying with every rumor of instability. Inflation and debt intertwined until few could distinguish growth from imbalance. Yet the facade had to remain perfect. The apartments had to open on time. The chandeliers had to sparkle. The illusion, once begun, could never be allowed to falter. In boardrooms and back offices, men calculated and recalculated, their optimism masking the quiet dread of exposure. A delayed payment could trigger panic. A failed investment could destroy reputations overnight. And yet, in public, they smiled. The illusion demanded confidence, and confidence required performance. Bankers gave interviews proclaiming prosperity. Developers hosted elaborate openings. Politicians praised the skyline as proof of the nation's strength. Beneath the applause, the foundations creaked. Inflation became the silent thief of the age. Prices rose faster than profits, wages faster than stability. Every dollar spent on luxury cost the builders double. Yet to admit financial strain would destroy faith in the dream. So they borrowed more, spent more, and built higher, hoping that grandeur would distract from insolvency. It was a dangerous game, one that relied on constant expansion, on the assumption that the illusion could be maintained indefinitely. The truth, of course, was that it could not. But in the Gilded Age, truth mattered less than spectacle. Even the architecture itself reflected the illusion, facades of stone hiding, interiors of plaster, gilded details concealing cheaper foundations. The beauty was real, but its permanence was not. The apartments dazzled the eye and reassured the heart, but they stood on ground that trembled with economic uncertainty. Every brick carried the weight of borrowed time. The illusion of prosperity was not simply a lie told to others. It was a lie that the entire nation told itself. In parlors and drawing rooms, whispers of financial strain mingled with laughter. Letters from Europe warned of tightening credit, but they were folded neatly and set aside. The illusion had become too precious to abandon. It was more than a show of wealth, it was a shield against fear or belief that progress could be willed into existence through sheer performance. To doubt the illusion was to admit vulnerability. And in an age defined by ambition, vulnerability was the one thing no one could afford. And so the dance continued. Elegant, relentless, unsustainable. The chandeliers still sparkled, the orchestras still played, the guests still toasted to fortunes that existed only in imagination. The illusion of prosperity had become the heartbeat of the Gilded Age, steady and seductive, masking the growing cracks beneath its golden surface. Beneath the marble columns and glittering chandeliers of the Gilded Age apartments, far below the gold-leaf ceiling and silk-draped parlors, there were hands calloused, cracked, and unseen that built the dream brick by brick. For every elite family who looked down from a grand balcony, there were hundreds who never looked up, who lived and labored in the shadows of the skyline they helped to create. The story of the Gilded Age is too often told through the language of wealth and vision, but its true pulse beats in the quiet endurance of the ordinary people whose struggles made luxury possible. Their stories were never carved into the marble. They were written instead in dust, sweat, and silence. The workers who built the great apartment palaces came from every corner of the world. Irish stonemasons, Italian bricklayers, German carpenters, and newly arrived Eastern European immigrants formed the invisible army that raised the walls of progress. They worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, scaling dangerous scaffolds without safety harness, lifting stones heavier than their bodies, often for wages that barely kept hunger away. Their labor was unending, their reward fleeting. In the eyes of the elite, they were replaceable mere extensions of the machinery of ambition. But without them, the dreams of grandeur would have remained only blueprints gathering dust in an architect's drawer. They rose before dawn, trudging through muddy streets and alleys filled with the smell of coal and horses, their breath visible in the morning cold. Many lived in overcrowded tenements just blocks away from the marble buildings they constructed, their families crammed into rooms where air and light were luxuries. Rent took nearly everything they earned, and the rest went to food that was often stale or spoiled. Yet they returned to the job sites day after day, driven not by hope of prosperity, but by necessity. To lose work was to lose survival. Even in the boom years, work was uncertain, wages delayed, and promises broken. The very economy that made fortunes for a few kept the many trapped in cycles of death. Behind the spectacle of progress lay an unspoken truth. The wealth of the Gilded Age was extracted, not created, from the bodies and lives of the working poor. Inflation gnawed at their meager pay, and the rising cost of living outpaced every raise. As developers and financiers borrowed vast sums from foreign banks, the burden of repayment trickled downward. When loans faltered, wages were cut. When investors panicked, workers were dismissed without compensation. In every great project, from the foundation of the Dakota to the towering facades of Fifth Avenue, there were moments when pay was withheld because creditors demanded interest before laborers could demand bread. The servants within those glittering apartments carried their own share of invisible struggle. Maids, cooks, and porters moved silently through the corridors of excess, their presence felt, but never acknowledged. Many lived in cramped servant quarters, sleeping beside coal chutes, or in attics where the ceiling pressed low against their heads. Their wages were small, their hours endless, and their dignity constantly tested by the whims of the wealthy. Yet, paradoxically, it was their care that allowed luxury to exist. The polished floors, the freshly pressed linens, the steady warmth of the fires they tended through winter nights. Their existence was both intimate and invisible, woven into the fabric of a society that refused to see them. In these years, class was not only a condition but a sentence. The poor could see the lives of the rich as clearly as the stars above them, yet they could never reach them. Children of laborers often worked alongside their parents, carrying bricks, cleaning streets, or selling newspapers to supplement the family's income. Education was a privilege for those who had time to afford it, and time was the one thing poverty never allowed. The working class lived at the mercy of the economy's tides, rising and falling not with their effort, but with the whims of men who gambled fortunes from behind mahogany desks. The panic years revealed just how fragile their world was. When banks failed and investors fled, the workers were the first to suffer. Construction halted, wages vanished, and hunger returned with a vengeance. There were strikes, desperate protests, and smaller rebellions in the streets, met often with silence or violence. Newspapers praised the resilience of the market, but ignored the families evicted from their homes, the mothers trading heirlooms for bread, the children who went barefoot through snow. These were the hidden costs of ambition, the depths measured not in dollars, but in human endurance. Debt, for the ordinary people of the Gilded Age, was not abstract. It was a constant presence, a quiet chain around the ankle of every working man and woman. Rent collectors came like clockwork, shopkeepers extended credit with interest that deepened the wound, and the illusion of progress demanded sacrifice at every level. The city grew taller, but the people at its base bent lower under the weight of survival. For them, luxury was not a dream, but a reminder of exclusion, of how deeply the lines of class had been carved into the heart of modern life. And yet, within that struggle, there was also a kind of defiance. The same hands that built marble mansions also built communities in the margins. Immigrant families shared what little they had. Neighbors cared for one another when illness struck, and workers found strength in solidarity. Labor unions began to form in secret, whispers of resistance spreading through taverns and alleyways. They demanded fair wages, safer conditions, and the recognition of their humanity. Their cause was often crushed by the combined power of business and government, but the seed had been planted. The ordinary people who labored unseen were beginning to see themselves not as victims, but as a force. The irony of the Gilded Age was that the same system that glorified wealth depended entirely on those it disregarded. Every flicker of gaslight in a penthouse depended on a miner deep underground. Every glittering dinner party depended on a cook's aching back and a servant's steady hand. Every grand apartment owed its beauty to the sweat that mixed with mortar and dust. The line between grandeur and exhaustion was thin, and it was crossed daily by those who could never afford to stop moving. Women bore a particular weight in this invisible labor. While the men built the skyline, women sustained the home and filled the factories, sewing garments, packaging goods, washing clothes for pennies a day. Some served the families who looked out from the high apartments. Others kept their own families alive with endless, unseen toil. They aged before their time, their hands rough and eyes weary, but their endurance was unbreakable. They carried the nation forward in silence, holding the edges of society together while the wealthy debated progress over champagne. For the elites who occupied the new apartments, the struggles of the work class were distant echoes, muffled by velvet curtains and soft music. They preferred not to look too closely at the cost of their comfort. The wealth of the few was sustained by the hardship of the many, but to acknowledge that was to risk shattering the illusion of moral order. Charity galas were held, coins tossed into the fountains of conscience, but the system remained unaltered. The same hands that accepted donations in daylight were forced to work in darkness the next morning. The story of the Gilded Age is often told through the lens of innovation and grandeur, but its true narrative runs deeper, through the worn hands of those who made that grandeur possible. They were the quiet architects of history, the invisible foundation upon which every mansion, every apartment, every symbol of progress was built. Their sacrifices were not recorded in ledgers or memorials, but in the very stones of the buildings they left behind. The grandeur that defined the era was their labor made permanent, their suffering immortalized in marble that would never bear their names. It began with a whisper, small, uncertain, barely noticeable beneath the hum of prosperity. But soon the whisper became a tremor, and the tremor became a storm. The Gilded Age, once radiant with confidence and illusion, began to crack under the weight of its own ambition. What had been built in gold and marble was suddenly measured in debt and fear. The collapse came not as a single moment of ruin, but as a slow unraveling, a quiet betrayal of faith in the permanence of wealth. It was the reckoning that every era of excess must face when the dream falters and the illusion turns to dust. The panic of 1893 tore through the nation like fire through dry grass. Banks shuttered, railroads went bankrupt, factories closed their doors. Men who had been masters of finance awoke one morning to find their fortunes gone, their properties seized, their reputations in ruin. For the grand apartment builders and their investors, the collapse was devastating. The palaces of the elite, those towering symbols of triumph, suddenly stood as reminders of fragile glory. Mortgages could not be paid, foreign creditors withdrew. Loans called in by European banks strangled entire projects mid-construction, leaving skeletons of steel and stone standing silent against the skyline. The financial panic exposed the rot beneath the Polish year of speculation had inflated prices beyond reason. Developers had borrowed against hope, stacking debt upon debt, in a dizzying pyramid of confidence. For a time, it seemed sustainable as long as everyone believed. But belief is the most volatile currency of all, and once it faltered, everything collapsed with it. The illusion of prosperity that had fueled the Gilded Age evaporated, leaving behind a landscape of halted dreams and hollow luxury. For the rich, the fall was shocking but survivable. Many retreated behind the walls of their inherited wealth, their losses painful but not fatal. For the builders, the entrepreneurs, and the financiers who had staked everything on the promise of endless growth, it was ruin. Men who had once thrown lavish banquets now hid from creditors. Once celebrated names disappeared from the society pages. Some fled the country, others took their own lives. Pride, the great engine of ambition, turned inward and consumed them. But the heaviest burden fell on those who had no cushion to soften the blow. The working class, already living on the edge, plunged into despair. Construction sites emptied overnight. Factories reduced wages or closed entirely. The same hands that had built the symbols of the Gilded Age now struggled to afford bread. Lines for food stretched through the cold streets, and the glow of electric lights in the mansions above seemed to mock the darkness below. The divide between rich and poor, once veiled by the spectacle of progress, now stood stark and undeniable. Inflation and deflation danced cruelly across the economy. Prices for necessities rose even as wages fell. The value of the dollar shifted like sand, making every purchase an act of anxiety. Foreign investors, once the lifeblood of American expansion, demanded repayment in gold. The government scrambled to maintain confidence in its currency, depleting reserves and deepening public fear. Panic spread from city to city as newspapers printed the grim tally of bankruptcies and unemployment. The optimism that had once driven innovation now curdled into bitterness. Developers of grand apartments found themselves ensnared in financial webs they could no longer control. Many had borrowed heavily to complete projects that no longer had buyers. Luxury apartments that had once symbolized untouchable prestige now stood half empty, their opulent halls echoing with silence. Renters vanished, investors defaulted, and the architects of ambition faced lawsuits and foreclosures. The very structures that had embodied confidence now embodied collapse. Their beauty remained, but their promise was gone. The panic did more than destroy fortunes, it stripped away illusions. The myth of endless growth, the fantasy of untouchable wealth, lay in ruins. People began to see what they had refused to acknowledge, that the prosperity of the Gilded Age had been built not on stability, but on speculation. Behind every shining tower there had been a ledger filled with risk, and behind every elegant parlor, a mortgage waiting to be called in. The collapse made visible the fragility of an entire social order. And yet, amid the ruins, there were those who refused to surrender. The crisis forced new questions about labor, about fairness, about the very structure of the nation's wealth. The collapse had shown that even the rich were not immune to fear, that the foundation of luxury was as unstable as the ground beneath the workers' tenement. The panic, brutal as it was, revealed the shared vulnerability of all who lived under the same economic sky. Still, recovery was slow. The years following the crash were heavy with doubt. Banks reopened under tighter scrutiny, but trust was not easily rebuilt. Investors approached with caution, and developers hesitated before breaking ground on new projects. The lavish confidence of the Gilded Age gave way to something quieter, more cautious. Even the elite learned to temper their displays of wealth, for extravagance had come to look like arrogance in the eyes of a suffering public. The apartments that had been built before the collapse took on a new meaning in this changed world. They stood like monuments to both ambition and folly, beautiful, enduring, but haunted by memory. The people who lived in them were no longer symbols of progress but of survival. Their grandeur became a relic of a vanished optimism, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. In the aftermath, inflation continued to haunt the nation. The cost of living rose unevenly, wages lagged, and foreign debts lingered like ghosts. The once celebrated architects and investors struggled to adapt to a humbler age. Some turned their focus to practical buildings, abandoning the extravagance that had defined their earlier work. The city itself began to change, its skyline still impressive, but its spirit more subdued, more cautious of the dreams it once chased so recklessly. The human toll of the collapse reached far beyond the stock market. It reshaped faith in progress itself. The American dream, once painted in gold, began to take on shades of doubt. People questioned whether the pursuit of wealth had blinded them to the cost of humanity. The glittering apartment palaces, once seen as emblems of civilization, now seemed almost tragic, like gilded masks worn over faces of fear. But the collapse also left behind something unspoken yet powerful: resilience. Out of the ashes of failure came new movements for reform, new conversations about labor and justice. The crisis had exposed the imbalance between the few and the many, and, though the system endured, it could no longer hide behind illusion. The working class, whose suffering had been ignored during the years of plenty, now found its voice. The panic had cracked the facade wide open, and from that crack came awareness. The developers and financiers who survived learned hard lessons about risk, but the workers who endured learned harder lessons about strength. In every city, in every factory and union hall, the collapse became a story passed down, a warning that wealth built on instability could never last. For a brief, glimmering moment, the Gilded Age had seemed eternal, its palaces invincible. But time and truth had revealed the fragility of even the grandest dreams. The panic did not end the age, but it changed it forever. The gold that once dazzled the eyes now seemed to shimmer with melancholy. The skyline remained, but its meaning shifted. Each apartment, each tower, each marble arch stood as both a triumph and a memorial to ambition unchecked, to faith misplaced, and to the unyielding truth that every age of glory carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. They still stand, those vast and dignified apartment palaces, their facades softened by time, their windows reflecting the slow pulse of a city that long ago outgrew its golden youth. The Gilded Age has faded, but its monuments remain quiet, resolute, and haunting. They are not merely buildings. They are testaments to faith, not faith in gods or kings, but in humanity's stubborn belief that beauty, even when born from excess and uncertainty, could outlast the chaos that created it. In the shadows of debt and despair, amid the collapses and recoveries, there was always this small, persistent conviction that what was built with imagination and courage could endure. It was faith that carried the nation from ruin to renewal, and faith that turned risk into legacy. The men and women of the Gilded Age lived in contradiction. They knew the instability of their wealth, the fragility of their markets, the volatility of the very ground they built upon. Yet they continued to build. Every stone placed, every beam raised, was an act of belief in a future they could not yet see. For the developers who risked bankruptcy, the architects who drew impossibly grand designs, the laborers who worked through exhaustion and hunger, creation itself became a kind of prayer. They built because they had to believe in something greater than themselves, something that might redeem the sacrifices, justify the depths, and outlive the despair. When the panics came, when the loans vanished and the investors fled, many of these visionaries faced ruin. Yet, even as they fell, their creations endured. The apartments that survived those dark years stood as silent witnesses to both their triumphs and their defeats. Marble and stone, unlike paper fortunes, could not evaporate in a day. In the ruins of broken markets, the buildings remained unchanged, immovable reminders that human ambition, however flawed, could still leave something beautiful behind. Their survival became symbolic, not of the success of capitalism or the power of money, but of the unbreakable will to create meaning out of uncertainty. Faith, for those who lived through the Gilded Age, was not blind optimism. It was a hard, deliberate choice. It meant building when failure was more likely than success. It meant borrowing when repayment was uncertain, dreaming when the world seemed determined to crush the dreamer. This faith did not belong only to the wealthy visionaries, but also to the ordinary people who kept the city alive. The masons who laid the bricks believed that their labor mattered, even if their names would never be known. The servants who polished marble floors believed that endurance itself was a kind of victory. The shopkeepers, the seamstresses, the street vendors all clung to the fragile hope that tomorrow could be better than today. For many, faith was the only currency that never devalued. the immigrant families who crowded into tenements just blocks from the glittering avenues carried with them stories of struggle and survival. They looked up at the great buildings rising above the skyline, saw not symbols of exclusion, but proof that creation was possible. Those apartments, unreachable as they were, stood as evidence that the city could be remade, that something enduring could emerge from chaos. It was faith, not wealth, that held the nation together through its cycles of boom and bust. Time changed the meaning of those buildings. What began as monuments to luxury became archives of memory. Their walls absorbed the whispers of generations, children born, fortunes lost, lives rebuilt. The opulence of the Gilded Age faded, replaced by quieter forms of beauty. But the architecture endured as a reminder of what belief can build. Every cornice and carved doorway carried within it the echo of those who refused to yield to despair. They were the cathedrals of ambition, built not for worship but for wonder, not for power but for permanence. The faith that sustained the Gilded Age was not only economic but deeply emotional. It was the faith that beauty itself mattered, that to create was to assert one's existence against the indifference of time. In an age ruled by debt and speculation, this belief was almost radical. The developers may have sought profit, but the act of creation, of shaping marble into meaning, transcended might. It was an attempt to tame impermanence, to write one's name into the city's soul. For those who lived through financial ruin, for those who labored in obscurity, the knowledge that something lasting could emerge from their work gave purpose to the struggle. Even after the panic years, when wealth dissolved and optimism dimmed, the city itself became a living testament to endurance. The skyline, once a symbol of arrogance, became a monument to resilience. The great apartments were no longer merely homes for the privileged. They became chapters in a longer human story, proof that even the most fragile ambitions can yield something timeless. Each building, each facade, told a story of risk and recovery, of loss and renewal. They were born from greed and desperation, but they endured because of hope. The passage of time stripped away the gilding, revealing what lay beneath, not just extravagance, but craftsmanship, not just profit, but persistence. The men who financed the apartments often fell into obscurity, but the artisans who carved their details left their fingerprints in stone. Their faith was humble, but it was also pure. They believed that what they built mattered, even if no one remembered their names. And in the quiet rhythm of their work, hammer on chisel, hand over mortar, they left behind the true legacy of the Gilded Age, not the illusion of endless wealth, but the endurance of human effort. As generations passed, the apartments witnessed the shifting fortunes of those who lived within them. The world changed, wars came and went, currencies rose and fell, the city itself transformed, but the old buildings remained. They became a bridge between eras, linking the reckless confidence of the past to the quieter perseverance of the present. Each crack in their stone, each fading ornament, told of endurance against time's erosion. What began as a monument to opulence became a lesson in humility, that permanence, once sought through gold, was found instead through faith. To walk among them now is to feel that faith made tangible. The marble may be worn, the gilt may have dulled, but there is something profoundly human in their endurance. They remind the world that beauty built in uncertainty can outlast certainty itself. The financiers are gone, their ledgers forgotten, but the walls they raised still breathe. Within their quiet resilience lies the story of an age that refused to surrender to collapse. It was not wealth that kept these apartments standing, it was belief passed down through every generation that refused to let the dream die. Even in the face of failure, faith endured as the hidden architecture beneath every stone. It was the force that carried a fractured nation forward, that made people build when everything urged them to stop. The Gilded Age may have been an era of illusion, but the legacy it left behind was real. The enduring conviction that beauty, no matter how costly, is worth creating, that progress, no matter how fragile, is worth pursuing. That faith, even when misplaced, can build something that time itself cannot erase.